This is the story of what if EasyJet flight 6074 had collided with a mountain while on approach to runway 28 at Malaga Airport. On September 2002, an EasyJet Airbus A319 was en route from Manchester to Malaga. At 8:57 p.m. local time, the pilots of EasyJet 6074 were handed off by Manchester ATC to Malaga ATC. As the plane was approaching its destination, the pilots got the airport in sight and they continued their approach to runway 28. Malaga Airport has two runways. Runway 28 is the longer of the two at 3,299 meters, or 10,824 feet long, but it's also the shorter of the two, because it has an approach obstacle right at the beginning of the runway. That obstacle happens to be 141 meters, or 462 feet. Tall, and it's located just 4,700 meters, or 15,000 feet from the threshold of runway 28. This means that the pilots of any plane landing on runway 28 will have to make sure that they clear this hill before they can line up with the runway. As the plane approached the airport, the pilots selected the ILS for runway 28. ILS, or the instrument landing system, is basically a radio beacon that helps guide planes into land. With the ILS selected, the pilots checked their navigational equipment to make sure that it was all working properly. They had double-checked all of their calculations, and they ensured that they would have enough speed for the approach. The first officer put the gear down, and the jet sped along the localizer. Soon they would be lining up with the runway. But there was a problem. The pilots noticed that they were too high for the approach. The controller asked them to do a go-around, but the pilots declined that offer, and they decided to push it a bit further. But then, disaster struck. The plane hit the hill. It ripped off both wings in the process. The plane started to break apart. The fuselage lost altitude. Then it hit the ground. Thankfully, the plane came to rest about 2 kilometers or 1.2 miles from the end of the runway. Somehow, 148 people survived the crash, but 13 people didn't. One of the things that the investigators looked into was the weather at the time of the crash. They wanted to know if the weather played any role in the accident. The day of the crash, the weather at Malaga was bad. There was fog and mist in the area, and visibility was not more than 500 meters or 1,600 feet. But even though the weather was bad, the visibility was well above the minimums for the approach. So the pilots were well within their rights to continue the approach. When the pilots took the ILS of runway 28, they knew that they had to cross the hill before they could line up with the runway. The pilots calculated everything correctly and planned to be well clear of the hill by the time. They needed to be lined up with the runway. But something went wrong. The pilots were so focused on maintaining a glide path that they never realized that they were getting too low. They were well below the glide slope that they needed to be on. The question is, why did the pilots continue the approach? Well, the answer's pretty simple. They didn't have anyone telling them that they shouldn't continue the approach. When the controller asked them to go around, he wasn't giving them a command. He was just asking them to go around. And the pilots saw that they were close to the runway, so they decided to continue the approach. Let's be honest here. The controller should have told them to go around. The thing is, the controller was dealing with a lot at the time. It's just a minute before the EasyJet plane hit the hill. There was a British Airways 747-7 that was taking off from runway 04. At the same time, there was also a finer Airbus A320 that was lining up on runway 28. The controller was also talking to another plane that was on approach to runway 28, so he didn't have much time to talk to the pilots of EasyJet 6074. In the cockpit, the pilots were getting ready for the approach. They had double-checked everything, and they were pretty confident that they would clear the hill. The captain had flown this approach many times before. He knew exactly what he had to do to clear the hill. But the thing is, he didn't. He flew the approach like he normally would, but he forgot one key thing. He forgot that he had to take into account the weight of the plane. The heavier the plane, the lower the glide slope would be. But he didn't factor that in, and he ended up flying too low. So here's the million-dollar question. If the pilots had done everything right, would they have cleared the hill? Oh, it's hard to say for sure, but they might have. If the pilots had flown the correct glide slope, they might have cleared the hill. But then again, they might have hit it. Here's why. Runway 28 at Malaga is a really short runway. It has a lot of obstacles near the approach end of the runway, which makes it hard to land on. One of those obstacles is the hill that we talked about earlier. The hill is 141 meters, or 462 feet tall, and it's located just 4,700 meters, or 15,000 feet from the threshold of runway 28. This means that pilots have very little margin for error when they re-landing on runway 28. If the pilots had been flying the correct glide slope, they would have had a bit more margin for error. They might have been able to pull out a last-minute maneuver to clear the hill. But who knows? We'll never know what would have happened if the pilots had flown the correct glide slope. In the end, the pilots tried to go for a short runway approach with a plane that was too heavy. They didn't take into account the weight of the plane, and they ended up crashing. What would you have done in this situation? Would you have listened to the controller and gone around? Or would you have pushed it and tried to land on the runway? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. As I was writing this video, I was thinking about how close this one was to being a catastrophic accident. The fact that it was a foggy day might have saved the lives of many people. You see, on a normal day, the pilots would have seen the hill. They would have seen that they were too low and they would have gone around. But because it was foggy, they couldn't see the hill until it was too late. So in a way, the fog saved their lives. There are a lot of lessons that can be learned from this accident. For one, the controller should have told the pilots to go around. He knew that they were too low and he should have told them to go around. Second, the pilots should have gone around. They knew that they were too low and they should have gone around. Third, the pilots should have taken into account the weight of the plane. The heavier the plane, the lower the glide slope is going to be, and they didn't take that into account. So what is the moral of the story? Well, if you're too low, go around. It's better to be safe than sorry. Thank you for watching this episode. If you like the videos that I make, do consider liking and subscribing. It will really help us grow. I will catch you guys next time. Stay safe.